Welcome, everyone. And thank you so much for joining our discussion today. I'm Emily Lydgate. I'm a law professor at Sussex University and the Deputy Director of the Center for Inclusive Trade Policy. And I'm really thrilled to have with us today Devin McDaniels, the Deputy Secretary of the WTO Technical Barriers to Trade Committee at the WTO Secretariat, Ritvika Sengupta, a net zero policy manager at the BSI and policy analyst at the OECD, and Claire Rigg, the head of climate performance practice at the Exponential Roadmap Initiative. So I'm going to briefly present some findings from a report we did recently for the BSI called Trade, Organizational Standards, and the Net Zero Transition. And then we'll turn to panelists for a discussion. So the idea of the event is that we'll bring together different perspectives on how organizational standards can support both trade and the low carbon transition. So I just first wanted to send huge thanks to my co-author, Xinyan Zhao, and the BSI, Ritvika and her team, who are absolutely brilliant to work on with this report. And I thought I'd start with a kind of a overview of what we were trying to achieve with this report, which is, first of all, what are organizational standards? Defining standards can be a surprisingly dicey undertaking. Second of all, what is their relevance to trade, in particular in the context of technical regulation? And finally, how should key actors, some of whom are on this call, in fact, think about the role that they play in the net zero transition and at the WTO? So organizational standards are a pretty broad church. I've picked out three of what I see as the key salient features here. The first is that they're voluntary. That means firms choose to comply with them, though, as we'll see, they can also sometimes form part of compliance with mandatory regulation. The second feature is that while most historical discussion on trade and standards has really focused on products, and more recently, we've seen a major expansion in what you might describe as process standards that focus on how goods are made. Organizational standards aren't, strictly speaking, either of these things, in that they focus largely on not particular goods or services, but the firm or organization that produces them. And they tend to focus ultimately on trying to change firm behavior and implement principles. So our lit review showed that there's a trend towards standards and also regulation, such as recent EU due diligence regulations, becoming over time less focused on placing requirements in products and services and more focused on placing requirements on firms. So this is actually a really salient issue in the trade world. Organizational standards that focus specifically on the net zero transition or aspects of it are a relatively new phenomenon. The most directly targeted is the ISO net zero standard, which is currently being developed. And in this report, we looked at two very different case studies. We have the ISO greenhouse gas accounting standard, 140641, which is a public international standard, as well as B Corp, which is a private certification scheme granted by B Labs to firms that meet high environmental and social standards, including on climate. And the UK is actually the second, has the second largest uptake of B Corp certification in the world after the US. So I'll just highlight three areas of our findings. One of them is about the kind of the opportunities and challenges associated with this focus on behavior. The second is about the relationship between standards and regulation. And finally, the role of the WTO. So the fact that organizational standards focus on firm behavior is a big part of their value in supporting the low carbon transition, because in order to implement them, firms have to step back from the kind of day-to-day operational necessities. They have to think about things like, who are our suppliers? What are our energy sources? Who are our investors? What are we investing in? What's happening downstream? What should we be doing in 5 years, et cetera. But there are also challenges associated with this strategic focus, and that includes challenges in the effectiveness of these standards in achieving their objectives. So, for example, B Corp provides a kind of a toolkit for encouraging improvements in sustainability, but it's also been subject to criticism because it's difficult to verify that these improvements have been sustained. The scores are cumulative across a really wide range of indicators, so it's hard to benchmark achievement. And it seems to us that the forthcoming ISO net zero standard is also going to face challenges of this type. How do you benchmark progress? How do you avoid a situation where you verify two firms as having met the standard when they actually have really different levels of ambition? How do you deal with the moving target nature of attaining net zero? And if we look at this issue in the context of trade, this emphasis on firm behavior to some extent limits the role that these standards can play in what you might describe as traditional goods trade facilitation. So if we think about, for example, emissions accounting, the ISO greenhouse gas emissions standard, accounting standard, provides principles and guidance, but it doesn't prescribe particular accounting methods. So, that means that two organizations could develop methodologies which are compliant and come up with very different results for their organization level emissions. So, and also organizational standards like this are applicable to a wide range of sectors, products, and service providers. So if we look at, for example, discussions in the WTO Secretariat on carbon accounting, they focused on steel and aluminum. So this is a very sector-specific approach. It's a bit tricky to connect the dots between the sector product-specific approach and a kind of a firm-level accounting standard. However, there are examples, and we'll look at a net zero specific one in just a moment, where compliance with organizational standards does help firms demonstrate that they've met environmental regulatory requirements, including some that are necessary for export. So there's a lot of literature on these well-established standards like ISO 14001, which shows that they actually help trade. So I would say overall, it's a bit of a mixed picture about how useful and how relevant these are for trade, but regulation comes across as a really important element of increasing their use and relevance. And that brings us to the second topic, standards and regulation. So in our case studies, we saw that they can have complementary relationships or competitive relationships. So a really interesting trade-related trend is increasing regulatory requirements for firms to report on not only the emissions that they produce, territorially, but also that are in all the components, so their value chain or scope 3 emissions. The most prominent example of this is the EU CSRD, but also the state of California and some other jurisdictions are introducing these. Scope 3 emissions accounting is really challenging for firms. I think we'll come on to that a bit more later. So if you've already implemented an organizational standard that requires this, you're far ahead of the game. And this is the good complementary example is that the EU has recognized the ISO accounting standard and the greenhouse gas protocol as interoperable with some of the CSRD requirements. However, in other contexts, the greenhouse gas accounting standards compete with the greenhouse gas protocol in the sense that they do largely the same thing, though slightly differently. And I would say that ISO is in some respects the loser in that competition, largely because it doesn't tend to be supported by US regulatory frameworks. And standards also risk becoming obsolete if regulatory requirements surpass them. So for example, B Corp up until now hasn't required mandatory scope 3 emissions reporting. And so they're being surpassed by CSRD. So now they're introducing it. So I think that shows how standards have to innovate and change to remain relevant. Finally, third point on the WTO. Our literature review showed that the uptake of organizational standards, not surprisingly, is easiest for big multinationals in wealthier countries who are most likely to have aligning domestic regulation as well as the resources and the capacity to implement the standards. And this risks excluding small firms and firms in developing countries from benefiting from them. So the WTO is a multilateral organization. The TBT agreement includes standards in its remit, and this accessibility dimension is a really important part of where the WTO has a role to play. Both the TBT agreement and committee have recognized that the trade facilitating role of international standards. So when international standards come up as a specific trade concern, it's most often because members are requesting other members to base their unilateral regulations on international standards. The TBT agreement also encourages this, but there's a lot of concern about what might be described as process legitimacy. So, standards whose formation, whose verification doesn't include a role for all countries' national standards bodies and conformity assessment bodies. And another big concern is about the proliferation of standards. They can actually bar market access rather than facilitating it. So we spent a lot of time in the report, but I won't spend a lot of time here working through this kind of definitional uncertainty about where do you draw the line between international standards and private standards. Are organizational standards part of the remit of the TBT agreement? I think the key point here is that that the TBT agreement provides a code of good practice and principles for setting international standards that are provide really useful guidance in terms of making standard setting more transparent and inclusive. So I'm just going to finish off with a couple of kind of takeaways in the form of the recommendations that came out of this. So I'm just going to put these all up. We really hope that our report would help, feed into the net zero standard setting process for ISO. And what we saw is that it has the potential to make a number of contributions. The first is that we have all these standards on different aspects of net zero, but just codifying these and identifying best practices has the potential to be very useful through a kind of umbrella standard. Also, the fact that ISO provides the ability for national standards bodies to participate gives it more of this process legitimacy. We don't know how the compliance will be verified, but the participation of national accreditation bodies will embed it into the so-called quality infrastructure, which Ritwika, I'm sure, could tell us more about. So this all contrasts with unilateral regulation or some voluntary standards, which basically allow firms to certify themselves as compliant. Regarding the WTO, I think I'll skip over that for want of time, but we can get into how different bodies can help avoid competition between standards and regulation. And I'll just finish by saying that there's a lot of useful tools and fora already available to address some of the concerns about accessibility in the WTO, and these include the Code of Good Practice, some recently concluded TBT committee guidelines on conformity assessment processes. So I'm going to stop there because we have a lot to get through. But I wanted to just first of all, I'm ending with the TBT agreement in the WTO. We have someone on the call who knows a lot more about that than I do. So I'd first like to turn to Devin and ask him to reflect on, how do you see the relevance of standards for trade and climate conversations at the WTO? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you for the invitation. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I'll just preface this by saying that I'm just going to speak here in my personal capacity. So what I'm saying really doesn't reflect, and it's not on behalf of WTO or its members. So with that being said, I think there's really 3 points that I wanted to raise here about the connection and the linkages between standards, trade, and sort of climate discussions and how that can be relevant to the WTO. So 3 points on trust, on cost, and on the development angle. So first, if we think about the increasingly complex world that we face, I think increasingly fragmented global economy that we face and we are encountering with every day today, I think one important thing to keep in mind is standards are really crucial in this kind of context for building that trust and enabling progress on, and providing the framework to enable progress on global commons problems like climate and net zero. So that trust, whether it's it's between businesses, industry, regulators, suppliers, consumers, NGOs, about whether it's you were talking about methodologies and underlying emissions or progress towards net zero targets is crucially important, and to build that confidence in that progress. And standards are really a non-politicized, agreed way of doing that. So I think that's one important point, building that trust for trade and for net zero. Then when we think about costs, and Emily, you already mentioned a bit of the TPT agreement, the WTO context, and of course, we know that standards, and especially international standards, are really important for facilitating trade because they reduce trade costs and avoid divergence between different markets in terms of regulatory and other requirements. So it's both about bringing down the costs of trade through promoting the use of international standards, through the TBT agreement, and also, of course, the six principles for international standards, which are the way in which members seek to identify international standards without defining what is an international standard. So that's one part of it. But also, it's standards and the trade connection. It's also important in terms of the cost of net zero itself. So in trade helps to bring down the cost of green technologies, make provide investment certainty, and really that enables companies to feel very confident about investing in large, long-term investments in breakthrough technologies, green tech, and all of that. So that's a really important part. And then just lastly on the development dimension, because you also mentioned it, but it's really, really important part of this is that as we think about the net zero transition, there are going to be lots of opportunities that are created for developing countries, but also potentially challenges. And I think the idea and the goal has to be, how do we enable developing countries, especially least developed countries, the poorest countries, to be able to benefit from this transition. And that's also about enabling them to really leverage the green comparative advantages that they might have. Because, for example, whether it's about renewables or production of green hydrogen, so they can really play a vital role in decarbonizing industry, transport, and other sectors as well. So that part is crucial, and having common approaches, agreed approaches for measuring, for labeling, all of that stuff through standards is vital, and also brings down then the costs for developing countries as well. So just maybe those 3 points in terms of thinking about trust dimension, the cost dimension, and how do we ensure that developing countries can really benefit from this net zero transition.
Brilliant, thank you. Ritvika, one of the things that I found really interesting about working on this report was learning more about the national standards bodies. I think as trade lawyers, we tend to focus very much on kind of regulation. So it's a whole world that was relatively unfamiliar to me. So I was wondering if you could offer some reflections on why is the BSI interested in the interactions of trade and regulation for net zero?
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily, and thanks for having me on this panel. It's great to be here today. So yeah, I'll just pick up on that first point, actually, because the term international standards has been mentioned a few times, and just for everybody on the call to kind of bring you into that common sort of understanding of what we mean by that. So BSI, British Standards Institute, is the UK's national standards body. We are recognised by government. And most countries will have some kind of a standards body like that. Often they sit within government. In some countries, they sit outside of government, but are recognised by government. So we're an example of the latter. But the crucial thing is that standards bodies around the world, like ourselves, participate in multilateral processes on standards development specifically, and we represent the interests of that country. So BSI represents UK interests in international standards organizations like ISO in standards development. And if you look at the membership of ISO, there are, I think, around 171 members. So that means standard bodies from around the world. So it's a really global reach, and it's a mechanism to bring countries from around the world together in a consensus-based process to develop international standards, which, as Devin and Emily have alluded to, are really important for trade because they are a key to ensuring that we reduce barriers to trade and allow for that interoperability across borders, which is so crucial when we think about scaling climate governance. And that's really why BSI has been interested in this interaction specifically of sort of net zero standards and trade. And I would say there's two main reasons why we became interested in this and worked with Emily and her colleagues. One is that if you look at the net zero space, the governance space, there is a proliferation of guidance. So there's lots of different framework standards. They're all called different things. It's an alphabet soup. And actually, the University of Oxford has a great study on this, where Oxford Net Zero looked at 37 initiatives that focus on net zero to kind of see, what are the commonalities, what are the differences. But I think what's interesting about this is that there are commonalities between all of these different initiatives and standards and guidance on net zero, but there are also differences. So it makes it quite a difficult and fragmented landscape in many cases for both businesses and policymakers to navigate, and that is, why BSI, along with all our stakeholders and our partners, Icontech, the Colombian national standards body, proposed the development of the ISO net zero standard to really bring together all of these really important actors from across the climate space who are doing really quite novel and phenomenal thinking on climate governance and net zero governance, to kind of codify that knowledge and to help bring that knowledge together into this standard. And I would say the second thing why we're really interested in space is because, we're seeing, I would say in the past, when you said standards, people often thought of products. So, maybe safety of your toys or mobile phones. But in the net zero space, we are talking more and more about the behavior of organizations. So we're seeing this broad concept of what quality means for net zero move maybe more from products to more about actually firm level behavior and organizations' long-term strategy. So really interesting to see that trend happen. And I think actually in the net zero space, we spend a lot of, maybe 90% of our time talking about how an organization is behaving rather than a product specifically. So that's why we kind of wanted to really work with CITP on this important project.
That's really helpful context. Thank you. And I'm sure some of these themes will come out more later. So Claire, you work with companies, so I'm really keen to get your perspective on organizational standards and whether they're actually effective in supporting, companies to undertake this kind of long-term strategic thinking.
Yes, thank you, and thanks to everyone for the invitation. Nice to be here, and nice to work with Emily on the report. So just very briefly, Exponential Roadmap Initiative is a collaborative climate initiative and a partner to the Global Race to Zero campaign. And in my role, I assess, advise, and nudge companies, as Emily was suggesting, to hopefully do more in their climate action. And I'm also working on the ISO Net Zero Aligned Organization Standard mentioned previously. So we work with companies on setting goals, we work with them on decarbonisation plans, we work with them on reporting, and also on product and portfolio transformation. And in all of that, we find ourselves referring to various standards, but of course, as has been mentioned, a proliferation of standards. So when it comes to setting goals, we have the SBTI, for instance. We also have the basic carbon law, which was developed 5 years ago or so, and which we still work with. And it's very challenging sometimes for companies to know where to go and which standards to use over others. Similarly, with transition planning, when we were trying to help our companies to make their climate transition plans, we reviewed we chose actually just 12 of the existing frameworks on what should be in a transition plan, and found that they had a lot of similarities, but also some differences, and some were broader and some were narrower. So until standards become regulation, it's very hard for companies to know where to turn. We try to help them with that, of course, but there's continuing diversity. So when we look at the also the standards landscape at the moment, particularly, we have the challenge of updates and revisions, for instance. So when we have both the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and SBTI and ISO standards that are relevant to our companies going through revisions at the same time, we all often feel we're in a bit of a limbo, I have to say, about what's coming next. And there are ongoing questions we get, every week about what's going to happen at the when these standards are finally land in their revised versions. So when we work together with companies and look at the advantages, though, on the other hand, of these organizational standards, then I think they provide guidance, literally, what should companies do? They should do what's in standards. And they provide clarity. So it's about promoting best practice and defining what that is. And hopefully that brings all businesses up, not just the ones that actually choose to fulfill certain standards. They also provide standardization, incredibly important at the moment, for instance, on definitions. What are residual emissions, for instance? What do we really mean? And can we all agree on a definition? So that even those who don't use the standards can refer to them for guidance, clarity, and standards definitions, for instance. And then there's a question of why companies choose to comply with voluntary standards. That's before these requirements get into regulation. And we see that as being largely about competitive advantage. It's about being able to say, our company fulfills this, so we're a better company. And then lastly, I'd say that as we all know, or what we've seen rather, voluntary standards are a point on a conveyor belt, the term coined by Tom Hale at Oxford University, which shows that ideas of what companies should be doing are on one side, and then you have a conveyor belt where those ideas get taken up and become put into guidance, for instance, and then they get into standards like ISO standards, and then at the end of the day, they do some of these ideas find their way into actual regulation, either based on standards or actually legal requirements. So what companies can do is look out for those voluntary standards and say, okay, we think that's worth doing now, because then we're ahead of our competition, essentially, because that we expect will move along the conveyor belt and become regulation. So that's where we see some of the opportunities. There are challenges today, and we always will be in such a fast-moving field, but we would support and continue to support our companies on those kind of journeys.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to open it up to the Q&A in a bit, but first I wanted to ask a couple of questions to really all the panelists, but maybe we'll start with you, Devin. So where in your work do you see the biggest challenges for climate-related trade measures?
Thanks. It's a very good question. But I think what comes to mind would probably be it's a challenge, but also an opportunity. And that is the question of interoperability. So I think I've heard that word mentioned a few times, but this is really the idea and the recognition that, and also I think Ritika also mentioned this as well, there are plenty of standards. And the reality is that we are in a world where there will be a coexistence of different standards and methodologies for measuring emissions across sectors, across different parts of the value chain, whether we're talking about organizational or site level or product. There's just a multiplicity. And it's difficult to just imagine that we're all going to converge to one single standard, even though that would be the sort of optimal first best solution. So in the absence of that, interoperability is really a nice way of making progress. And it's the idea that standards, methodologies, schemes, certification, whatever, they need to be able to talk to each other, use the same language. So data from one seamlessly is incorporated in another, so you can convert easily between them, which really brings down transaction costs. And again, builds more of that trust and confidence that I was talking about before. So there is a dynamic discussion on this as we speak at the WTO, especially in the Committee on Trade and Environment, where there's a number of proposals on the table from members on this. So, whether that's about, experience sharing or best practices guidance or something else that members decide. So I think that's an interesting discussion that continues. Of course, there are lots of headwinds in global trade right now, but these topics of climate and sustainability I think are here to stay, and there's a lot of interest in the case amongst our members. So I think for me, it's a challenge because there are many different views on how to advance, and it's not just a WTO issue. This is being discussed in many different fora, from the Climate Club to IEA to standards bodies to regional organizations in many different places. And of course in industry as well. And so, but if it can advance in a good way, that's really an opportunity to help break down and avoid some of those unneeded costs and unnecessary complexity that slows down the net zero transition.
I'm curious if this is kind of how this looks from your perspective, Ritika, in particular, whether this is the same kind of challenge you would identify.
No, I completely agree. And actually, I think what I was planning to say is kind of very much aligned to what you just mentioned, Devin. So yes, I think that's the key. The key thing is that we are in a system of different actors, and I think one of the biggest challenges for us right now is that we are all working on climate as we should be. It's one of the biggest problems we're facing in generations. But I think one of the things I would love to see is more connection between different actors and a wider understanding of the different actors that we need to get from, almost to get from planning and setting targets through to actually delivering against those targets. And so one of the kind of, biggest challenges for us right now, particularly in the standards and assurance system, is communicating what we do and actually connecting directly to climate action actors across the NGO space, across the business space, across the policy space. One of the things that that's really struck me over the last couple of years working with our diverse stakeholders across the climate space is that we are often coming up with similar ideas, and actually we can do so much more when we just join up, whether that's coming up with a way to measure emissions or a way to come up with our long-term strategy on climate. I think there's a real need to go and speak to people that you don't normally speak to. If you're going to conferences and you're speaking to the same people, then I think that's not the point. We need to kind of almost break those barriers and those silos and start working across policy, business, standards, assurance, measurement, all of these different technical and non-technical actors. We almost need to see that horizontal collaboration. And just kind of on that, just to say as well that we are doing a lot of work on trying to understand with our partners how we can better mobilize the standards and assurance system. So I mentioned national standards bodies before. There are other such national bodies around the world that do the kind of assurance or the measurement part of it. So many countries will have a national metrology institute. Many countries will have a national accreditation body. And these also, in the same way that national standard bodies kind of coordinate in multilateral forums, these bodies also coordinate in multilateral forums. So we are really focusing on how we can connect this system, which is often called quality infrastructure, the infrastructure that helps you show quality, how we can connect that system better to the climate actors that we're working with.
It's interesting because it seems like there's a real common thread between the challenges that you've all identified in terms of, just a bewildering array of different requirements and the need to basically find a way for for these different ways of approaching the same problem to be able to be used interchangeably by basically private sector actors and recognized by regulators. So yeah, I'm interested in kind of how feasible that is and how easy it is. But Claire, let me bring you in as well in terms of what you see as the big challenges right now.
Well, of course, I'd echo what's been said about multiplicity of standards and actors. I did see about 6 months ago an actor mapping that someone also at Oxford had done, and it was just a full page of NGOs and frameworks and all the rest of it. And I was just looking at market instruments recently and found that I needed to look at approximately 10 serious international actors all looking at the same question. But that is innovation, of course. So we perhaps shouldn't forget that that multiplicity of creativity will lead us somewhere. And hopefully the best ideas will come out in the end. I just wanted to mention, though, about Scope 3 as a particular challenge, because trade, of course, is about value chains, and we are in a globalized world, and especially for the global corporates who have the most power and resources to change things for us. And there, of course, we have challenges, again, around interoperability, about standardization, about data availability over borders, and whether that's done in the same way, methodologies, as was mentioned before, and even reporting. And there are lots of struggles around those things at the moment. And then, of course, what we all want to get to is actually reducing value chain emissions, but without the traceability, standardized measurements, etc. It's always difficult. And then we also get to dependencies across borders as well. So we did a recent look at some transition plans and found that companies aren't writing, at least they might be thinking about, but aren't writing about their policy dependencies. And so the more we can get the business landscape linked up, possibly through trade, with the country landscape, then the more chance we have to actually create systemic change.
Great. Okay. And then just one more kind of prompt for me. So obviously, we've had a lot of turbulence and distraction from global commitment to climate change from the U.S. election results. So it feels like a lot of attention has been distracted from that at the moment. So I'm just curious for your sense of kind of how much momentum is there to are we still proceeding apace towards the net zero transition, and also more specifically, what are the really exciting what can we feel really excited and optimistic about? What are the frontier themes and concepts that on trade-related climate measures right now?
I can start. So you asked us, are we still moving on track, essentially? We see both. So we see companies feeling uncomfortable, for sure, and we see companies also saying, no, it doesn't matter, we've got our plan, we're going forward. So I guess the bigger challenge there is about those dependencies that I just mentioned, that if companies aren't supported, if their transitions aren't supported by the policy changes, either subsidies being removed or added, or by infrastructure changes and energy transition, then their transitions can't happen. But strangely enough, I was wanting to mention also one thing which I think is actually exciting, plus extremely challenging, and that's around those market-making instruments which I mentioned. So people may be aware that in commodity markets, that tends to be global markets where many, many millions of players buy from the same market, but there are millions of them, and the traceability isn't there for influencing on emissions. Then we have to find some new ways to finance those transformations. And I find this an extremely difficult area to even think about a lot of the time, but there are lots and lots of, what's really exciting is there are lots and lots of really smart people considering ways in which companies can be enabled to and incentivized to invest in global transitions, which are very hard to manage, and to be able to do that in ways that avoid greenwashing, that have lots of the right guardrails. And so I think there is a real movement at the moment, which will take perhaps a year or so, but great creativity going on in that area.
I can jump in, Emily, if you want.
Please.
There's lots of exciting things going on at the moment. The main sort of, I guess, outcome-focused one that I would flag is, of course, the development of the net zero standard and the ISO process, which we've mentioned already. And I think that's particularly exciting because it's an opportunity for stakeholders from around the world to be involved quite directly with an outcome, a standard. So it's a really, if you're interested, please do get in touch with your national standards body or reach out to us, and we can obviously point you to people and how to engage. And I think kind of that's almost an example of the wider sort of exciting theme that I think is happening, which is that people are, I think, starting to talk more and more about actually taking actions or scaling what they're doing, which I don't think we were really even there a couple of years ago or a year ago. So, I recently went to a climate conference where actually most of the chats I had were about, actions that companies and policymakers are actually taking that are making some kind of a difference to a real metric. And I think that is really exciting. And that's why these sort of standards and assurance processes are going to become so important, because that is how you can demonstrate progress, and ultimately in the long term how you can measure and make sure that the progress you make towards Paris Agreement is, as Devin was saying, kind of interoperable around the world, that you're not measuring against different things, that you are actually demonstrating some common progress. So I think that's really, really exciting.
Yeah, no, just very to add quickly on this one, and I think it's something I mentioned before, but maybe worth highlighting again is for me, I think one of the big opportunities is really trying to find ways to help ensure that this transition is really one that promotes development, growth, and opportunities for the poorest countries. So really, what and there's a great match between renewable energy generation, providing the inputs for lower emissions, whether it's aviation shipping fuel, whether it's for decarbonizing the steel industry, or other sectors. And developing countries can really have a natural advantage, this kind of just from climate, sometimes it's geographic location, where they can really help to actually change and reshape value chains towards more decarbonized value chains, which also is then creating also job opportunities, growth, and is a win-win really for climate and trade. So I think that those trying to look more at those types of partnerships and opportunities are really exciting as well.
But I just wanted to ask one more question. So I think as a trade lawyer, I've always been struck by how difficult it is for countries to recognize each other's regulation. You have years-long negotiations about even conformity assessment, mutual recognition. So I'm just curious for you, if you could just comment. I kind of alluded to this before, but just comment on what is interoperability? Is it the term that refers to just standards, and what does it actually mean, and is it easier to achieve than, for example, mutual recognition? Is it something that is, you think that, for example, Devin, do you see the WTO making progress on interoperability, or is it something that is really politically and challenging and touchy?
Well, I think that's really up in the hands of our members who are discussing that type of thing. Is there an opportunity to make progress? But so I think time will tell. But on your question on what is it and how does it compare to the things like mutual recognition and other types of tools, I think usually the way that I understand it, really, when we're talking about interoperability, it's a bit more technical, and really we're talking more about standards and methodologies and the data and the frameworks that underpin that. At a higher level, then you're thinking more about recognition, and that, if we're talking about government to government recognition, it's a different process. As you said, it's a negotiation. It needs to be underpinned with different mechanisms, whether that's accreditation arrangements, conformity assessment, or and other forms as well. But there are other mechanisms as well that governments can use, like regulatory cooperation approaches, to try to bring their requirements a bit closer. So I think it requires both sides. You need to make the standards, the technical side, more working together and more aligned, the same language, and that's really both of it's in the first instance, it's an industry concern, right? Because they're the ones that have to comply to report. But that will make it easier then for policymakers who need to also develop regulations based on those standards. And then for the regulatory side, which also there's work to be done, to bring approaches closer together, whether that's on a sectoral basis or in different ways. So yeah, plenty of work to be done. And I think it's on different fronts as well.
Okay, great. And I just saw that Frank put into the Q&A a kind of similar, but even more specific question. So I'll keep pressing you on this issue. But first, we had a question. I think this one is for me, on the process to choose which standards to look into. So why did we focus on ISO and B Corp? So I'm happy to take that on. So one of the reasons that we focused on those was because they're really different from each other. So we wanted one that was what would conventionally be defined as an international standard. So something where national standard setting bodies are involved in making the standard. And then we wanted one that was basically private NGO driven. Because we thought it would be interesting to see how those both worked into the kind of standards and regulation ecosystem. And then also we just kind of workshopped it with BSI and got their input. We had only a really limited amount of time to write the report. I think it was like 4 months. So we didn't want to do the kind of there's been great other work done by my colleagues Andrew Lang and Greg Messenger about FSC, so we kind of crossed that one off. The Oxford report that Ritvika mentioned is really, really comprehensive in terms of indexing and cataloging standards, so we didn't want to do that kind of work. We wanted to get more in depth, and we were really grateful that people were willing to talk to us, because it's always hard to knock on people's door and ask them to talk to academics. So that was basically the reason. And then in terms of Frank's question, so it's very similar to the question I asked, I think, in terms of the feasibility of interoperability. And he says, he asks, recognize that full global harmonization is unfeasible. What steps can we take even to get to a basic level of meaningful interoperability? Which international bodies have the authority and legitimacy to decide what the overarching principles are, and how do we ensure that these have the buy-in of all countries? I don't know who wants to take that one on.
Maybe I could just make a comment, at least to start us off, which is that I thought it's very interesting in your report that you raised the issue of competition between standards, voluntary standards. And if we go back to the conveyor belt from ideation to regulation of what companies should be doing, then somewhere in the middle of that, competition is a good thing. We get innovation, we get lots of people vying to be best. But at the end of the day, when we get towards the regulation side and for companies' sake, we actually, the competition is challenging. That essentially leads to the problems of lack of operability, because different actors are trying to solve things in different ways. So unfortunately, though, of course, in the end, when parties are competing, somebody in the end will cede ground. That's, I guess, what will happen. So what we hope is that the best ideas from all those, if we have a melee in the middle of this conveyor belt of lots of standards all trying to find the right way forward, then what we hope is that the best ideas will come out at the end and go into regulation. But in the middle, we have a rather uncomfortable sort of competitive landscape, maybe.
Just to come in quickly on this point as well. So I think it's not for BSI to answer that question necessarily, but kind of picking up on the themes of that question, what Claire mentioned. I think one of the things that in the study that Emily mentioned, done by Andrew Lang and Greg Messenger, one of the things that they looked at was kind of other sectors which are more mature but have maybe not had harmonization, or that it still contains, a lot of actors. And one of the ones they looked at was the sustainable forestry landscape, and how it had achieved a level of interoperability. And it was interesting because on paper it had achieved interoperability in that countries were trading, and there was a global trade in a variety of sustainable forestry products. But there was still an underlying kind of issues with things like consumer trust. And that was really quite difficult at times for kind of management of risks, essentially. And it was interesting to see, because I think it again kind of brings to mind that question that you asked, Emily, of sort of what is interoperability. And, for us, I think in the standards and assurance system, it's really understanding the different processes that support governments around the world to recognize each other's kind of processes and mechanisms and policies, to enable that back and forth, or to find some kind of a common ground, whether that's using the same standard or acknowledging each other's testing facilities, acknowledging each other's certification bodies. There are sort of processes that already exist that we've been using for a really long time for trade, that it's now really necessary that we start to mobilize them for net zero governance, specifically to enable that next step of interoperability.
I mean, this is really interesting, because you hear this word all the time, but this is the first, I think it's actually quite difficult to, I'd love for someone to write more about interoperability, or point me to an excellent analysis.
Can I just jump in, Emily,
Yeah.
very quickly on this one? Just on Frank's question, I think it's a very good question, but I mean, one thing I just wanted to point out is that, I mean, a first very basic and obvious observation is, don't reinvent the wheel. So the problem is that I think, and it's sort of already been said, but the problem is that there's continuous, what tends to happen is that there is, of course, incentives for different new standards to emerge. And then there's this, we already heard from Claire about the competition, et cetera. But of course, there might be market needs, but I think the best thing that can be done is look at the existing guidance that's already out there, that's already being well used in the marketplace, and that's a basis upon which you can draw from. And then the tools that we have, that WTO members have developed, can also be useful for promoting interoperability. So I'm thinking here, and you mentioned them in your slides at the beginning, that the WTO TBT 6 principles, which help to identify what are relevant international standards and promote more coherence between standards, more transparency. And also, you mentioned at the beginning, the TBT guidelines on conformity assessment procedures, which is really helping the regulators in each country to figure out, okay, for this product with this risk, what kind of procedure should I approach? Should it be third party? Testing, inspection, what should I be doing? What are the considerations? So those tools, by having these common principles that can underpin the way that governments intervene, that can also help create the conditions for more interoperability, maybe.
Okay, great. And I would just interject as well that, I mean, it's interesting because one of the things we saw from our analysis, if you took, I mentioned a few times, the tension between, not necessarily tension, but, the replication between the greenhouse gas accounting standards on the one hand and the ISO 14064 accounting standard, greenhouse gas protocol versus the ISO standard. And there, the ISO standard conforms more with the kind of the principles of international standardization, I think you could say, than does the greenhouse gas protocol. However, greenhouse gas protocol is far more widespread because it's just been, referenced by more countries. So there's also a tension where sometimes market power and market uptake can shape the proliferation of standards. So it's a kind of a dual dynamic. But on the one hand, you want market capture by one standard just because it makes it a lot easier for firms because, they're all doing greenhouse gas protocol, problem solved. However, you also want to integrate these principles of inclusivity and transparency and have the standards, and third-party conformity assessment, and you want the standards that incorporate those things to succeed. So it seems like market power is another important element of this discussion in terms of kind of which standards become more prevalent. Okay, there's a couple more questions.
Sorry, Emily, could I jump in and comment on that, or do you want to go to the next question?
No, please.
No, I think that's a really important point, and actually this is a bit of a plug, but as Emily mentioned, I'm currently split between BSI and OECD. I'm wearing my BSI hat today, but just to say that the public governance team in OECD, specifically the team looking at kind of regulatory policy, are doing a report exactly looking at some of these interactions on kind of standards, assurance, regulation interactions, and how in the past some of it's kind of worked out a little bit organically, like you say, sort of market forces have sort of, something has happened over time and there's been a dominant standard or two or three or four. And I think that's a really interesting point and something that we're looking at in that report, which will be out this year at some point. Stay tuned. Because I think for climate, in many ways, we're at a point where we need to think quite strategically about governance. And actually, we maybe can't always do the sort of waiting game to see what happens in the end, but rather we're sort of seeing actors be quite proactive. So I think it's really interesting because you're right. We do need that innovation and that market force working to see what the end outcome is. But equally, there is also now a need to sort of take strategic decisions now so that we're able to meet targets in 2030, 40, 50, and beyond. So I think there is a little bit of a not a tension, but I think something that we need to think more about on how we think about climate governance and maybe the differences in climate governance compared to how we've sort of done governance before.
Great. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll summarize the rest of the questions, and then I'll give you each a chance, because we only have 3 minutes left, to have a final word. So we had a question about ISEAL. Did we look at it? No, we did not, but I'm very happy for any of you to come in with a comment about its principles and how it filters through regulation in this space. We had a comment about the problem of consistent auditing of a standard to ensure that there's no essentially standards fraud about net zero. And finally, we had a question about where cooperation is needed, at what levels. I assume that means kind of what bodies need to be involved and where. To support greater interoperability. So I think interoperability is the real takeaway from this from this session. So I'll open it up to any of you who want to come in or just give a final word.
Maybe a very quick final word. I think, yeah, all very good questions. ISEAL obviously very important, and that's another area. Those sort of voluntary sustainability standards that are, of course, crucially important to this whole discussion, and many of the similar challenges exist. So it's important to think also about that. Yes, and then on the question of sort of auditing, or you can talk about conformity assessment against related to standards. That's very important too, and that's also about, again, what I was saying at the beginning, giving confidence, enabling the net zero transition to progress. And then on cooperation, I think it's a bit of a challenge, because on the one hand, you might think it's something that industry should sort out, or the standards body should work together. Yet you still have this effective competition and between different standards and different technologies within a sector that may prefer one or a different type of standard, which against which they may perform better, or their competitors might look worse. So there's these dynamics. So on the one hand, maybe it's industry, but on the other, then governments, maybe they need to get involved, but then you might not have the right kind of people or expertise there. So then it's sort of this ping pong, who should be taking the lead. And I think that's still a challenge, but that's why we have many different processes going on. And I hope that I think that there's again, opportunities to make progress.
Thank you.
Perhaps I can just jump in then as we finish. So on the claims question, that actually, of course, I think calls for another set of actors to come in, because claims is usually about marketing. And then, so therefore, we need the climate standards to work with the marketing and standards around what you can say in public, and then with the marketing regulators and ombudsmen such as well. And then on the cooperation, the level at which it can happen is between standards bodies. So once there's a certain maturity and certain stability in what people are thinking needs to be standardized and how, then I think we have to move to a situation where standards bodies are willing to learn and work together, and hopefully or create something new, so that we don't recreate the same thing as each other. So I think we see signs of that happening, which is always nice to see.
Perfect segue to you, Ritvika, for the final word.
So actually, I've already spoken a lot, so I'm just going to say, please download the paper and read it. Emily and her team have done such a great job, and please get in touch with us if you have any questions or ideas. We're always looking to better understand where we can go next in the climate policy landscape. So yeah, do give us a shout.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for being here. It's been a real privilege to get to hear your perspectives on these issues. And thanks everyone for listening and for your excellent questions, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.